Hello, good morning, and welcome to the 4th Annual Savannah Book Festival presented by the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation. And this beautiful venue, Trinity Church, is sponsored by Dr. and Mrs. Tom Lyons. And now for a few housekeeping rules. The Savannah Book Festival is open and free to the public, but it's not without cost. So if you do enjoy today's speaker and you'd like to make a donation of cash or checks, there are some donation buckets at the back of the church by the doors when you exit. Also, please remember to turn off your cell phones. We do have restrooms available to the public, courtesy of Royal Restrooms. They provide high-quality, very clean restrooms on both sides of Telfair Square. There consequently is a restaurant also outside. Time permitting, at the end of this presentation, you'll be given an opportunity to ask some questions. Please make sure that your questions are in the form of questions. You'd be surprised. Books by presenting authors are available for sale in the Ex Libris bookstore. That's between Trinity Church here and the Telfair Museum. And authors will sign their books there immediately after the presentations. And now, the New York Times has called Carl Merlantes' debut novel, Matterhorn, a final exorcism for one of the most painful passages in American history. The story follows Bravo Company, a U.S. Marine unit, as it takes and retakes a hilltop fire base near the DMZ and Laotian border in 1969 Vietnam. Merlantes, 65, a highly decorated Marine Corps officer, a Vietnam veteran, and a Rhodes Scholar, he wrote and revised the novel based on his experiences during the war over a 33-year period. He worked as a consultant to the international energy companies during the day and wrote early in the mornings and late at night while raising 5 children with his wife. During the years of rejection by publishers, he was told to rewrite the novel for the first Gulf War, then for Afghanistan, but the Washington State resident remained unwavering in his devotion to tell the story of political incompetence and wartime drudgery. Released nationwide in March 2010, it has won the prestigious Center for Fiction's 2010 Flaherty Dunham First Novel Prize, the 2011 William E. Colby Award, and the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Prize for the Best Novel of 2010. This author's appearance has been graciously sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. John Kane and Mr. and Mrs. John Robinson. So please join me in welcoming Carl Merlantes to the 2011 Savannah Book Festival.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful. That's the first time I've been in Savannah, and my wife is from Tennessee, and she's walking around saying, "This just feels like home." And I told somebody that this morning. I said, "You know, it's the warm air, the softness, and this is a Savannah resident." And she says, "Yeah, I mean it's heavy." So I just love this city. It's just an incredible city to walk around in, and I just appreciate so much the people having me here. It's a chance to see it and chance to leave. I live up by Seattle, Washington. It was 38 degrees and raining when we left. So this is another wonderful reason to be here. And I'd like to thank my hosts, and I'd like to also thank John and Stephanie Gutnagel for squiring me around, and my wife Ann, and making this whole festival. For Stephanie is an incredible piece of work, and thank you very much for that. It's really well organized. Well, excuse me, I was told the purpose of the festival is to sort of allow people to get some sense of who the author is, and to, you know, basically try and share a little bit about how I came to writing and how I do writing. And so I'm going to be probably telling stories for 20 minutes to a half an hour, and she said, then I'm happy to answer questions that are specific to the book, or anything that, you know, comes to mind. And then they're going to hustle me out of here because they're on a pretty tight schedule. But I grew up in a little logging town in Oregon, And I think I might be the only author here who had participated in 2 book burnings by the time I was in high school. And I have to tell you why that happened. When I first learned to write, I was about 7, and they were going to hold me back and do the first grade again because I didn't learn to read until that summer. And I can remember my father throwing chalk at me. You know, it's like, it was one of those frustrating summers, and finally I managed to get it together. So I started writing a diary, and one day, it's probably about 8 months after I'd started the diary, I went back and to read a page. It was New Year's Day, and a 7-year-old's New Year's Day, I was out looking for ducks out along this mill pond by a sawmill that was out by our house, and I remember reading about looking for the ducks, and then I remember reading about a water snake that I had watched slip into the water, and I got this overwhelming feeling of that will never happen again. And I think it was the first time in my life that the idea of mortality hit me. It was like, this will never happen again, you can't go back. And it scared the bejesus out of me. I mean, it's like ah! So the logical thing to do was, of course, to take my diaries, and I'd written all my dreams down at that age. I'd love to see them. I threw them in the burning barrel and burned them up. Somehow I'd make that go away. So that was the first book burning. The second one was a little more dramatic. I had gotten, by this time I was like 14 as a freshman in high school, and of course by that time I knew everything that I needed to know. And I decided that Christianity just had it wrong. And so I rewrote the Mass from the viewpoint of being just entirely grateful for all the evil that was going on in the world. I mean, you guys must know high school kids. It's like it is black, it is white, and so I rewrote the Mass. And my father, who was raised Greek Orthodox and pretty mellow guy, I have never seen him so angry. He got his hands on it somehow, and marched me out to the backyard and made me burn it. So that was, but I was fairly, as one of these people that was a little bit odd in this little logging town. I mean, my folks are all loggers or fishermen, and I fished with my grandfather for salmon on the Columbia. And I have to say that I was very lucky because I had Mrs. Whitty, who was the librarian, and the library had 2 rows in the same house that the fire department, the volunteer fire department, had the fire truck. And she was wonderful, and she was in cahoots with my father because I kept saying, when can I get a library card? And my father said, oh, you're not old enough yet. It's too big a responsibility. Okay. So a couple of months go by, my big brother's got a library card. Can I get, I don't know if you're ready yet or not. And so finally one day he decides I'm ready, and I'm going down, and there's Mrs. Whitty, and she's sitting behind her desk in the garage of the fire department, and there's this library card, I swear it's about this big, with sort of curlicues on it and stuff, and there's this ceremony, my dad's standing behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and I'm, this big, and Mrs. Whitty presents me with the library card and the opportunity to read books that I don't have to pay for. And I was really great. For about 3 months, I'd show up at the library with my library card. And then one day, my brother showed me his library card. And I realized that I'd been had. But actually, my dad was pretty savvy about that, the reverse psychology. But I was into a lot of odd things as a kid in this little logging town. We had the bookmobile, and Mrs. Whitty would ask me what I was interested in, and she'd order the book, and I was very influenced by The Celtic Twilight by Yeats. I must have read it 5 times by the time I was 10 years old. I just, for some reason, the stories of spooks in the walls and things like that, but all that Celtic mythology is stayed with me a lot, my whole life, and Matterhorn's stuffed with it. So if any of you people are into Celtic mythology, you can look for the cookies in Matterhorn and see where it is. It's actually based on the Parzival myth. Another very life-forming book. Do you remember landmark books? The story of Betsy Ross and the American flag, and I mean, they were this big. Well, one of them was called The Story of the U.S. Marines. And I think by the time I was 12, I'd read that about 20 times. And a poor book in the library was tattered because I was fascinated by it. And it makes me sort of think about it. I mean, you know, you come into the world and you have a certain destiny that just seems like you're going to have to perform. And I'm suddenly reminded of this quote by Carl Jung. Isn't it unfortunate that people go kicking and screaming to the destiny that they'd have arrived at anyway? And so I think that the landmark book was sort of laid there and waiting. And I did the most you know, teenage boys. I love Captain Horatio Hornblower, C.S. Forester. I read those several times, and Asimov and Heinlein. And then unfortunately Heinlein wrote Starship Trooper, which is of course the U.S. Marines in the future. And that fueled it. So when I was 18, I joined the Marines. Is that a surprise? And oh, I have to tell you, I forgot. This is the other thing. My first writing experience, other than these 2 book burnings, because I was reading Heinlein and Asimov and those folks. My cousin and I decided to write a novel, and we were 9. And I don't have any idea what our idea of a novel was. It wasn't what I ended up with Matterhorn, but it was about space invaders invading the Earth, and it was odd that 2 9-year-old boys saved the Earth. You know, so that was my first novel. When I was in high school, I was a football player, and I could never play baseball because I don't have any eye-hand coordination, and so I ran track. And in that little high school of 400 kids, those were the days when they talked about the service. Well, your uncle was in the service, you know, well, your dad was in the service, and almost all the fathers are World War II veterans. And so the boys just sort of figured that, well, you owe a couple of years. I mean, most of us weren't going to go volunteer, but if the draft notice came, it was like, well, you owe the service, you owe a couple of years. And so it was a time when you just signed up. And of course, the Marine recruiter told me, well, Marines guard embassies. And I'm like, that's great, you know. And he didn't lie to me. I mean, he also told the guy that actually joined with me, the guy says, well, he says, can you golf? And he said, oh, there's golf courses all around Paris Island. It's just really wonderful. And this poor sucker, he shows up on the bus with his golf bag. No, I'm not kidding you. And so he gets out of the bus, and you know, it's a scramble. People are screaming at you. You have to find these yellow footprints on the thing. And he's going, and the drill instructors just look like bees to honey. Look at this. What did you bring to boot camp? Some awful. And this poor kid. The rest of the time that we were going through it, we went through it up at Quantico. It's the same routine. Right shoulder arms, ka-chung, his whole bag of golf clubs. Marching into the chow, you know, everybody else has their rifles. He's got his golf clubs. I mean, he's probably talking to a psychiatrist to this day about that. You know. But anyway, I had, so I joined what's called the PLC program, and the war wasn't really in the newspapers at that time. This was 1963, fall of 63, and I had a scholarship to Yale, and so I went in the summer to boot camp, or whatever they called it. And then the war started cranking up, and I started thinking then maybe these embassies are not going to get guarded by me. And I won a Rhodes Scholarship, and I thought, well, there'd be no way that I could take a scholarship up, because the Marine Corps by 1967, which is when I graduated college, was really short of second lieutenants. And they were wonderful, and I wrote them a letter, and they wrote a letter back and said, you can go. And we'll just transfer you to London, and we'll put you on inactive reserve, and you know, see you in a couple of years. I was there about 6 weeks, and I started feeling guilty. I think there's no other word for it, which is that, you know, guys I'd gone through training with were over there fighting. out of my little high school, 5 boys died over there. That's that small town sort of stuff. And I was sitting there drinking beer and, you know, hanging out with the girls, and I was having a wonderful time, but there was this sort of cloud. And so I gave up the scholarship and sent a letter to the Marine Corps, and then very shortly I was back at Quantico, what they call the basic school. And then I was in Vietnam as an infantry platoon commander from about the 1st of October 1968 until October 1969. And ended up, because I'd gotten hit a couple of times, the Marines are just funny. They said, if you get 3 Purple Hearts, they say this guy's either so stupid, or he takes so many risks, or he's so unlucky that there's no way that he can ever be leading a unit anymore. And so they yank you out of the bush. And in my case, because you get hit twice, they go like, we had to game the system. 3 hits and he's in Okinawa, but 2 we can still use him. So he put me in the back seat of a little O-1 Charlie, these little spotter planes, and that's where these air medals came from. Because service guys always ask me, you know, how'd you get those air medals? It's because I was stuck in the back seat of a spotter plane and doing that kind of stuff at the very end of my tour. Luckily, I was able to get the scholarship back and started writing the book. And this is really sort of amazing. I mean, I hate the internet because once somebody gets something out there on it, and if it's wrong, it doesn't die out. I mean, in the old days, you know, if somebody wrote an article about, you know, something that you didn't like, or, you know, within 3 weeks, people would burn it or use it for, you know, lining the trash cans or something, and it'd be over with, but it lingers forever. And there's this rumor that Matterhorn's original manuscript was 1,700 pages long. Not true. What was 1,700 pages long was a madcap psychological dump that I did when I first came back from the war, because I thought, well, I'm going to write the great American novel. I mean, after all, I've been writing since I was 9 years old. I can do this. And I sat down at a typewriter. It was an Adler typewriter, a little electric typewriter, and that's old tech if you ever heard of that, and manically pounded out 1,700 pages, 5 pages on wet socks, and, you know, 3 pages on bug bites, and I thought, wow, this is great stuff, and I put it aside, and I came back about 2 weeks after I'd finished it, and I started to read it, and it was like, oh God, this is really bad. And I had given a copy to a friend of mine. He swears he's got it someplace. He said, I've never thrown it away, but he's going to blackmail me with it someday if he ever finds it. So what happened with this novel is that I started to say, I'm going to have to get serious about writing fiction, and I believe it or not, I didn't learn how to do it when I was 9 or up until that point. I started reading books, you know, how to structure plots, how to create characters, and I started reading people that I really admired. But when you start reading as a writer, you're looking behind the scenes, so to speak. It's like you don't sort of just flow with the story anymore. It's a different task. You're sort of going like, how did he do that? How did she make that character so sympathetic? Where were the 3 sentences that made you like her or dislike her? And then I started writing the novel, and I'd come up with the theme of Matterhorn, the mountain, the central sort of organizing metaphor, which is, in my opinion, the Marines built it, assaulted it, left it, assaulted it again, and then left it. And to me, it was the metaphor of the war, and that was how I started to organize it. And when I was partway through it, and believe me, it had belonged time to Germany. By that time, I had gotten very heavily back into Celtic mythology and Jungian psychology, and so I began to see that it's a story of a young man, and the Parzival myth is a story of a young man who has to learn compassion in difficult circumstances, and so then those 2 things fuse together in the creation of the novel. But I started trying to publish it in 1977, and no one would read it. I mean, just no one would read it. It was just, you know, Vietnam, no, we can't sell that. And literature, and it's difficult because there's a very difficult marriage in literature between art and commerce. And I think that any writers have to understand that. You can't I mean, just like I had to have a job to straighten my kids' teeth and pay for the tap dance lessons, these agents in New York, they have to do the same thing, and they see something come in and say, "Hi, I've got a 900-page manuscript about a war that no one likes." What are they going to think? Well, they're going to think, "I can't sell it." That's what they're going to think. And after 25, 30, I don't know how many rejection letters, the ones that I would get, because I heard the speaker last night saying that she's still waiting for replies from some of the people she sent out to. It's part of the game. I put it aside and I started working on it, evenings, mornings, weekends, and by the mid-'80s it got better and better, I think, and so I tried again, and then it was like, well, Hollywood's done this. Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, there's no way we can sell it, the market's saturated. Okay, and then she introduced me, it was like mid-'90s, why don't you just switch it to the Gulf, we could probably sell that. And I by that time I was so happy that Microsoft had come out with search and replace on Word, because I thought I could just, all I had to do was hit jungle for desert, and then I'd have it completely rewritten. Sometimes I wonder, agents, if it's like, do you know what we do, in our dark and sullen craft? That's what Dylan Thomas called it. So, the way it actually got published, and I think this is really counterintuitive, is that it was a group of women that actually got this novel published, because women usually I don't do war stories, I don't pick them up, I don't read them. And I had been trying everything, and nothing worked. And a friend of mine had a manuscript, and he got a phone call from an old friend of his who was a professor at Berkeley, who had started a little tiny, and I mean tiny, two-person publishing company in Berkeley called Elion Literary Arts. And if any of you see Matterhorn, you'll see it's published by two publishers, Grove Atlantic, who does all the heavy lifting, and Elion, who are the ones that actually picked this up. And the way that happened is my friend said, "Oh, I'm reading a great manuscript." And Tom Farber, who was the publisher, probably rolled his eyes. Everybody's friend's got a manuscript from a friend. He says, "Well, send it to my senior editor, Kit Duane, and she'll look at it." So my friend calls me on the phone. He's very excited. And I go, "Ken, this is a book about Marines in the Vietnam War, and you want me to spend $50 at Kinko's to make a copy of it and send it to a woman in Berkeley, California?" I may not be a great businessman, but I mean, at least I could. This is a bad investment. And he was great, because he shamed me. He says, "I'll pay for it. Just send it to her." And that was the big break. Kit Duane loved this book, and she convinced Farber to read it, and he liked it, and it got published. I mean, it was what they do is they go out, and it's a nonprofit, and they go to generous people, the people that kind of support things like the Savannah Book Festival, and they get enough money to make a small run of a paperback. And they made a 1,200 copy run, and my pay was 120 free copies. And so I could do as I wished with them, and I thought, well, this will be great, I've got a product now, I can start writing to agents and say, I've been published, I mean, what about a New York publisher? And I could send it to newspapers for reviews, and exactly the same thing. I mean, it was just that no one was interested. And after all these books that I read about how to write killer query letters, the way that the letter that'll get the attention of the people that you need. I mean, apparently I can write novels, but I didn't ever learn the art of query letter writing, because I just went nowhere with it. And my wife came up with this idea, which was a fabulous idea. She said, "The problem is no one reads it," right? Yes. Well, why don't we get Elion to submit it to a bunch of, contests? And if they have any integrity at these contests, they'll have to read at least 10 or 12 pages of this thing, and you just get them started on it. And so that's what we did. She and I went to work, mostly her, and put this huge spreadsheet together, and there's an unbelievable number of contests. First novel by left-handed Swedish immigrant to Ballard. And we wrote them all down, and we wrote the submission dates down, and we sent that off to Elion, and they said, "Okay, we'll do that," because they had, 900 unsold books. They could afford to do it, And They submitted to the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers contest, and the way that works is that staff volunteers read first novels for Barnes & Noble, and if they like them, they send them up to New York as sort of possibilities for the Discovery program. And some woman in the Midwest, I think it was like Milwaukee, loved this book. She sent it up to her boss, who's a woman named Jill Lamar in New York, and she loved this book. And she sent it to her boss, who's a woman named Cecily Hensley. By this time, Barnes & Noble is asking for more copies because they're having more staff and having to read it. And Farber calls me on the phone, and he says, you know, we need more copies. It's a good sign. I said, Tom, what happens if we win? And there's this long pause. He says, I don't know. Have you got any money? Because they wouldn't be able to gin up, you know, I mean, a 1,200 book run is not even one per store for Barnes & Noble. And if they don't sell, the retailers send these books back to the publisher, so the risk's on the publisher. And little places have died because they've, you know, gotten a sort of a Barnes & Noble prize or win like that, and they've borrowed money to go out on a limb to make the books, and it didn't work. And Cecily Hensley, who's their chief fiction buyer, who's a woman that is very respected in New York. I mean, if you're the chief fiction buyer for Barnes & Noble, you're very respected in the publishing industry because she can make or break a book. And she loved this book, but she knew that it would bury El Leon if they chose me. And so she went around to her friends in the publishing business and said, this little outfit in Berkeley needs a partner that can do the heavy lifting. And Morgan Endricken from Grove Atlantic flew out there and made the deal with Tom, and that's how it finally got published by the big boys in New York. People have often asked me, you know, it took a long time to write this. What kept you at it? And believe me, I mean, I would sometimes go on long, miserable, you know, misty walks in the Northwest and trying to decide whether I was crazy or not, because, you know, it's like, do you think you've got the talent? You think this book's good enough to keep putting the time in on it? And there were serious moments, and I was like, well, you know, but I always came down on the side of, I think it's as good as the other stuff I've read. So I kept at it. And when someone once asked me that question in a reading, I work in images, and what kept me trying to get it published is a different question than what kept me from just at writing it, because, you know, you can write whenever you want. That's the one great thing about the art form. But to get it published, I was like, why did I do that? And what hit me, and I think it's important, is that I was walking, I remembered walking from the Pentagon, because when I got back from Vietnam, I was assigned to Headquarters Marine Corps, and I had to carry some papers to the White House, and I was in my uniform. And about 2 blocks from the White House, right across the street, there was a group of protesters. And they were waving North Vietnamese flags, Viet Cong flags, and shouting obscenities at me, calling them, you know, the usual, you know, baby killer. And first of all, I want to go on record and say that most war protesters didn't do that, but a sizable minority did. And I was sitting there on the other side of the street, and the feeling was just sort of, you don't know who I am. I mean, you're just shouting this at some uniform, but I'm just, I mean, the people you're calling baby killers are probably 3 years younger than you are, 4 years younger. The average age in my company was 18 something. You know, they're babies compared to you, and only because they didn't get to go to college and you did. You're on this side of the street and I'm on this side of the street. And another incident was I sort of got stuck on this girl later on who was studying D.H. Lawrence, and so I thought, oh, she's terribly literary, and this will be fun. And we had a couple of dates, and I thought, you know, by this time my hair's kind of, you know, hiding out, and I thought, gee, should I tell her I was a Marine? And we're sitting at the bottom of the stairs that went up to her flat, and I said, well, you know, I was a Marine, and she stood up, and just like that, you know, horrified. They're the worst. And she ran up the stairs. And again, it was that feeling of, wow, you don't know who I am. And so I think that what I'm trying to do with this novel is just shout up the stairs, you know, sort of reach across the street and sort of tell our story. I mean, what it's like to be young and trying to figure your way through a pretty difficult experience. And, you know, you'll notice in the novel that I don't pull any punches. I mean, I call them kids, because that's what they are. And one of the reasons that I felt it was so important to write a novel and not a memoir is an experience I had. And if you see YouTube, you'll see this already, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So those of you who have heard this story, you'll have to sit through it, because it's a very important part of my development as a writer. Two of my children's godmothers, Kathy, kept after me to read Eudora Welty, and I was like, I don't want to read some Southern writer that writes about women, and, you know. I mean, I was like 32-year-old hotshot, you know. And I don't know, she's really good. You ought to read this book, Delta Wedding. But she kept at me, and finally I said, okay. I mean, to get her off my back, I'll read Delta Wedding. And when I first started out, it's a story of a woman who's organizing a wedding on a huge cotton farm in the Mississippi Delta. And she is trying to do something very important. A wedding, a symbol of love, civilization. She's in charge, she's trying to do it right. When I first started reading it, one of the big crises was that the little flower girls were going to be dressed as shepherdesses, and their shepherdess crooks were being made at Memphis. And in those days, it was just dirt roads, and they hadn't shown up yet. And the wedding's coming closer and closer, and I'm going, this is just trivial stuff. Who cares about these shepherdess crooks? By the time I finished that novel, I was into her. I was seeing the world through her eyes. I had identified with the character. And I was going like, where are the damn shepherdess crooks? You know? Because it was going to be done right. Then it was going to be done right up to the last, you know, bit of it. And it hit me what the power of literature is. And one of the great powers of literary fiction is this ability to allow readers to identify with characters. Because when you identify with somebody who's outside of your skin, you expand your consciousness. You get bigger. You learn what the world looks like through their eyes. And that makes you more empathetic, and that makes it easier to cross barriers that you normally wouldn't cross. And I think it's a very healing and a very important function of literary fiction, is this ability for people to identify with characters. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, and then I'll go into the questions and answers. I said I was remembering, the only training I got in speech making was in the Marine Corps. They taught the second lieutenants they have to make a speech. Here's all you need to remember is the 3 B's. Be short, be funny, and be seated. But I was at a reading, and a woman came up to me, and tears, I mean, she started crying. It wasn't like just moist, I mean, she started sobbing. And after she sort of got it together, I was like, wow, what's going on here? She told me the story. Her father was a war protester, very, very angry about the war, against the war, and had protested the whole time. And he had 2 brothers, her uncles, and they both joined the Marine Corps and went to Vietnam. And one of the brothers was killed. And when the other brother came back, he and the war protester brother never spoke to each other after that time. She said that she lived 40 years in that family where the 2 brothers never spoke to each other. If there was ever any mention on her father's part, it was always about, you know, he just drinks a lot. You know, they just never did. And it's a microcosm of what happened in this country. It's the worst divide that this country has experienced since the Civil War. And we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about, you know, if our father's an alcoholic. It pervades the entire family structure, but it's the elephant in the room, as they call it. We don't talk about dad's drinking. And our foreign policy, our politics, the way people choose political sides, regional differences are still highly influenced by Vietnam. We're in a war right now that I could go down the characteristics of it, and I don't think you could tell which war I'm talking about until I identify it. It's a big part of our culture. What happened is that she bought them each a copy of the book. And her father saw the world, he identified with some characters in the novel, and understood what his brother had gone through. And he called his brother on the phone, first time in 40 years. And his brother apologized to him for being so, stubborn about contacting him because he was, undermining his brother's death. And they've started talking, and they are now talking to each other. That wound seems to be on its way to healing. I heard the story and I just went, wow, power of literature, and people are involved in it. People here who come to book festivals, people that sell books, people that write them. It's an amazing value to the community. Another example of this power is if a guy came up to me, had 5 books. Oh, wow, this is great, because we've been trying to remodel the kitchen for years. How come 5? And he said, well, he was a Marine in Vietnam and operated about the same area the book took place. And he said he's been trying for 4 decades to tell his wife and children what it was like. And he said, I never could do it. I'd start to choke up, tears would come, I'd leave the room, I'd go duck hunting for the weekend. And he said, I'm going to give them each a copy of this book, and it's going to do my talking for me. And it just, again, I had this feeling of I'm so pleased to be part of that chain of how it works. And another example that was important to me was Berkeley, California, where I told the publisher, you're not sending me to Berkeley, no, it'll be all right. And I thought this was going to be bad, but I went to Mrs. Dalloway's bookstore in Berkeley. It's an independent bookstore there, and the room was full of 99% people who had been against the war. And I started doing my thing, reading the book, and questions started coming, and the feeling in the room was incredible. They didn't, after a few questions to me, they started talking to each other, trying to recall the time period, trying to understand what were they doing, what part of what they were doing was important, what part of it was bad. A lot of them had been the minority that were spitting on the soldiers. And they were working it out in that room because of a book and because of an independent bookstore. So there's just an enormous power to literature. And I see that now my be seated time has come, so I'm going to just stop with those several stories and open it up to questions.
You dedicated your book to your kids. You said something to the effect concerning the good and the bad, growing up in a household of a combat Marine officer. What effect do you think your experiences had on your kids?
Yeah, it is the good and bad. And, the good is that I'm terribly proud to have been a Marine. I mean, you can't talk to a Marine who isn't proud about being a Marine. That's what we do. And I learned a lot about discipline. I learned a lot about sticking to it. I mean, even if it gets hard, you can still get it done. And so that I tried to impart to my children, and that was the good side. The bad side is that combat veterans almost universally suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was no exception. And one of my kids had dropped the milk, and it said, "Oh, you spilled the milk," and I'd go into a rage. A lot of curse words, spilled the effing milk, and so here's like my little 5-year-old girls are like, I spilled the milk. I mean, gosh, what's wrong with Dad? Well, no one knew about PTSD when I was raising my children, and so they learned to tiptoe around. If Dad's taking a nap and you got to talk to him, throw something in the room first. Because literally, I mean, if they woke me up and I was in a dream state or something, I mean, I would rise out of the bed and scream. And for little children, it was frightening. And I think that it was very difficult on my children to grow up with that, especially since we didn't know what Dad's problem was. Probably one of the worst memories is somebody startled me in an intersection. I was in the car with my daughter, my middle daughter, and when you have this condition, you don't think. I mean, that's why you live through the combat, because you hear a noise. There's no longer, I wonder if it's a bird. It goes straight to the amygdala, and you shoot it. Somebody honked their horn, and when I came to myself, I was on the hood of his car trying to kick his windshield in. My little girl's in the intersection, abandoned, and I'm going, something's wrong here, but I had no idea what it was. Luckily, someone, you know, figured it out, and I got to the VA, and I've learned how to cope with it, and life is much better. So it's a long answer to the question of why I dedicated to my children, and the good and the bad.
Your book reminded me quite a lot of a work of nonfiction by William Manchester, Goodbye Darkness, another Marine served in Guadalcanal and Okinawa. I'm wondering if you read that and what your reaction was to it, and if it had any influence on your own work.
Yeah, I did read it, and I always have found William Manchester, he's a terrific historical writer, and it was a book that I found quite meaningful to read. I've later heard that some of his stories were other people's stories, but you know, that could be sort of, you know, historians and academics carping at each other. I don't know the answer to that, but as far as I was concerned, it was very interesting to see what it was like to be a Marine in World War II, and how little things changed. Another one that's really good is Sledges, well, with the old breed in Peleliu, I think it's called, and again, it's astounding. And I was talking with Sebastian Younger, who covers the Afghanistan war. He's written a book, a nonfiction called War. Nothing changes. I mean, the technology changes, but what goes on is not changing. So it was important for me to read that World War II memoir because of that.
Have you been back to Vietnam, and if you haven't, do you have any desire to go back?
I've never been back. I've had friends who've gone back, and they've universally found it a healing experience. One of the things that always surprises them is that, you know, what the Vietnamese call the American War is just a sort of a small part of 300 years of fighting over there. They fought the Japanese, the Chinese, the French. And there's the American War, and 80%, I think, of that population, it's a third world country with that kind of population distribution, a lot of young people weren't even alive when the war was going on. And they say that there's been, every one of them has come back with a sort of sense of healing, and they say it's like if somebody from Spain came to the United States and was worried about us hating them because of the Spanish-American War. It seems to be that in our consciousness, in our culture, it looms, like I said, very, very large. In theirs, it's part of a long, sorrowful time where a lot of people suffered, and we were part of that. But and as far as going back, I'm a little nervous about it, and just because I don't want to sort of, you know, start having nightmares again. And but there is that chance that it would be more healing. But the other thing is that where I fought, I mean, I got dropped into the jungle in the mountains. I never saw a Vietnamese village the entire time I was there. I mean, it was in some ways really good, because if it moved, we could shoot it, because it was the North Vietnamese army. These guys that had to work around the villages, where if it moved, it might be the Viet Cong, it might be some girl that's trying to give you a sandwich, or maybe she's bringing a hand grenade, and those sorts of moral dilemmas were things I could always avoid. So going to Vietnam wouldn't be a return in a way, it would be going to a new country for me.
I was there 2 years ago with another friend. We just went to see South Vietnam and North Vietnam. And I can't tell you how many people, other veterans that were there, and what it was like to them, and how scared they were to get off the plane, they said, and what they might see. But also spoke to a couple Australians that said, you know, you Americans really did win the war. So I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you. You know.
What kind of reaction have you had from former or existing field grade officers, several of whom did not come off so well in your novel?
Right. I was a little bit worried. I thought that, you know, the Marines would disown me because I actually didn't pull any punches. And I've had that question before. What I did is that, first of all, you have to think about a novel. You need villains. And so I made a couple of villains. But these villains, they're not evil villains. What they suffer from is what we all suffer from. One of them happens to drink a little too much. And I've drunk too much in my life, and I know a lot of people that do that. One of them's a little ambitious, and you know, you don't run a corporation and become a Rhodes Scholar if you're not ambitious. And so the flaws in these characters are just the things that humans deal with. And that's what I hope that people would see in these two characters, Blakely and Simpson. And I did take a lot of characteristics of officers I served under that I didn't like, and I rolled them into these two people, and I've had a lot of people, especially the grunts, say, boy, it's about time somebody nailed them. Because there are bad officers. I mean, every organization has a bell-shaped curve, and there's great people, and there's people that really just shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And I know it's real hard for Marines to have someone say that the Marines aren't perfect, and I get some flack for it. But I have to say that I've been invited to Quantico several times, and I'm going to go to the Naval Academy because the Marine Corps has been so supportive of this book because they say it's so real. They know that they don't always have perfect officers, and they know that mistakes get made, and they say that this book should be read by any NCO or anybody who wants to be an officer, and it's been very satisfying to me that the Marines have embraced it so well. Apparently, at the Marine College in Quantico, they hand it out to their students.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but Mr. Marlantes will be in the book signing author's tent just right between Trinity Church here and Telfair, so please